Welcome back to the last report, where official records end and the real nightmare begins. Tonight, we're opening sealed case files from the Arizona desert, unexplained patrol incidents, reality distortions on desolate highways, and ancient warnings that law enforcement chose to ignore. What began as a routine traffic stop became something no training could prepare any officer for. So dim the lights, lock your doors, and listen carefully. This is the Arizona case. My name is Trooper Marcus Webb, badge number 2847, Arizona Department of Public Safety. I've been patrolling the highways of this state for 17 years, and in that time, I've seen just about everything the desert can throw at a man. Heat stroke victims hallucinating on the side of Interstate 10, drug runners making desperate runs for the border, tourists unprepared for the brutal reality of summer temperatures that can kill you in hours. I've pulled bodies from twisted metal, talked people down from ledges both literal and metaphorical, and I've learned to read the desert the way some people read books. But what happened on State Route 85, what I experienced during 3 consecutive night shifts in October 2023, challenged everything I thought I understood about reality, about time, and about the nature of consciousness itself. Before I tell you what happened, before I explain why I'm risking my career and possibly my sanity to share this, I want you to understand something. If you're watching this while planning a drive through southern Arizona, if you're thinking about taking State Route 85 between Ajo and Gila Bend after sunset, you need to pay attention. What I'm about to tell you could save your life. Drop a comment. Are you from Arizona? Have you ever driven Route 85 at night and felt like the road was longer than it should be? Like the mile markers weren't counting down the way they're supposed to? Have you ever lost time on that stretch of highway and couldn't explain where those hours went? State Route 85 runs roughly northwest to southeast through some of the most desolate territory in southern Arizona. It's a 128-mile stretch of 2-lane blacktop that connects Interstate 8 near Gila Bend to the Mexican border at Lukeville. For most of its length, it cuts through the Barry M. Goldwater Air Force Range to the west and the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument to the east. It's harsh country, the kind of landscape that doesn't forgive mistakes. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Water is scarce. Cell phone coverage is non-existent for long stretches. During the day, the desert shimmers with heat mirages that make the road ahead look like it's underwater. At night, the darkness is absolute, broken only by your headlights and the occasional glow of distant Lukeville or the lights of Ajo to the north. But there's a specific section of Route 85, a roughly 23-mile stretch between mile marker 47 and mile marker 70, where something fundamentally wrong happens. The Arizona Department of Public Safety doesn't talk about it officially. There's no bulletin, no formal warning. But among those of us who've patrolled this highway for years, there's an unwritten rule. Don't stop between markers 47 and 70 after sunset. Don't investigate disabled vehicles in that zone after dark. Wait for backup, wait for daylight, or if you absolutely must respond, get in and get out as fast as you possibly can. I learned why that rule exists the hard way. October 14th, 2023. That's the date that changed everything. I was assigned to night patrol, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., a shift I'd worked hundreds of times before. The night started normally enough. I fueled up my patrol unit, ran my equipment checks, and headed south from Gila Bend just after midnight. The desert night was clear. Temperature in the mid-60s. Perfect patrol weather after the brutal heat of the day. I had my coffee, my radio was functioning normally, and I was settling into the familiar rhythm of a night shift on a quiet highway. I passed through Ajo around 1:30 a.m., noting the few lights still burning in the small mining town, and continued south toward Lukeville and the border. At 2:17 a.m., my headlights caught something on the side of the road. Mile marker 52. A vehicle, a late model Nissan Altima, pulled onto the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. I'd estimate I was about 400 yards away when I first spotted it, and as I approached, I could see a figure standing next to the driver's side door. Standard disabled motorist situation. I called it in, gave dispatch my location, and pulled in behind the vehicle, positioning my unit at an angle with my light bar activated. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit. The temperature gauge in my patrol unit read 64 degrees Fahrenheit, but when I opened my door and stepped out onto the shoulder, the air felt wrong. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. It had a quality I've never encountered before or since, like the temperature existed, but didn't fully connect to my skin. The air felt thin, stretched, as if there wasn't quite enough of it. I approached the vehicle with my flashlight in my left hand, my right hand resting on my duty weapon. Following procedure I'd executed countless times. The figure next to the car was a woman, maybe mid-30s, wearing jeans and a light jacket. She looked up as I approached, and I saw her face clearly in the beam of my flashlight. Dark hair, olive complexion, eyes wide with what I initially interpreted as the normal anxiety people feel during a traffic stop. "Ma'am," I said, "everything okay? Is your vehicle disabled?" She looked at me for what felt like a long moment before responding. "Officer," she said, her voice quiet and strangely flat, "do you know what time it is?" I glanced at my watch. "It's 2:19 a.m., ma'am. Are you having car trouble?" She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I just needed to stop. I needed to understand." "Understand what, ma'am?" I asked, my training kicking in, noting behavioral signs that might indicate impairment or distress. She gestured toward the road ahead, toward the south. "How long have you been driving this highway?" I frowned. "I've been on patrol for about 2 hours tonight. I've been working this route for years. Why do you ask?" She looked at me then with an expression I initially read as pity. "Because," she said, "you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, and that's okay. Nobody ever does. Not until they experience it themselves. Ma'am, I need you to produce your license, registration, and proof of insurance," I said, falling back on procedure, sensing this interaction was heading somewhere unusual. She reached into her car through the open driver's window and pulled out her purse. As she did, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. She handed me her documents, and I examined them with my flashlight. Colorado driver's license, registration for the Nissan, current insurance. Everything appeared legitimate. "Miss Chen?" I said, reading her name from the license. "I need to ask, have you consumed any alcohol or drugs this evening?" She laughed, but it wasn't a sound that contained any humor. "No, officer," she said. "I'm completely sober. I wish I wasn't. I wish I could blame what I've experienced on being drunk or high. That would make so much more sense than the truth." "What truth is that, ma'am?" I asked. She looked past me, toward my patrol unit, and then back at the road ahead. "I've been driving this highway for 4 hours," she said. "When I started, it was 10:30 p.m. I left Ajo heading south. Mile marker 70, she continued, her voice taking on a peculiar intensity. That's where it started. The road ahead looked normal, but my GPS stopped working. The satellite navigation just showed a gray screen. Then the cell signal disappeared. "That's not unusual out here," I said. "Coverage is spotty in the desert." She nodded. "I know. That's what I thought too." So I kept driving. But the mile markers... She paused, looking at me to gauge my reaction. The mile markers started counting up instead of down. I felt something cold move through my chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean I passed mile marker 70 heading south," she said. "And the next marker I saw was 71. Then 72. Then 73. "The markers count down when you're heading south," I said, though I already knew she understood that. She nodded. "Exactly." So I turned around. I thought maybe I'd gotten confused. Maybe I was heading north without realizing it. But when I turned around and drove back the way I came, she took a breath. The mile markers were still counting up. 74, 75, 76. No matter which direction I drove, the numbers increased. "I've been driving back and forth for 4 hours, officer. I have a full tank when I entered this stretch of highway." She gestured to her car. "Look at my fuel gauge." I walked to her car and looked through the window. The fuel gauge read just under a quarter tank. "So you've used 3/4 of a tank of gas," I said, doing the mental math. "That's probably what? 300 miles of driving?" "Roughly," she said. "But according to the mile markers, I've only traveled between markers 70 and 77. 7 miles, I said quietly. 7 miles for 4 hours of driving." She looked at me with those wide, desperate eyes. "I'm not crazy," she said. "I'm a software engineer. I understand logic. I understand reality. But something is very wrong with this section of highway. I need to get out of here. But every time I try to drive away, I end up back in the same 7-mile loop." I looked back at my patrol unit. The radio. I'd call this in, get a supervisor involved, maybe request a welfare transport to get this woman to somewhere safe. But as I turned to walk back to my vehicle, I noticed something that made me stop. My patrol unit was parked roughly 30 feet behind her Nissan. I'd positioned it there. I remember doing it. But the distance between the two vehicles looked wrong. The perspective was off, as if I was looking at them through a lens that wasn't quite focused correctly. The space between the cars seemed to flex and waver, expanding and contracting in ways that didn't match what my eyes were telling me I should be seeing. I walked back to my unit, each step feeling like I was moving through air that had a different density than normal. When I reached the driver's door, I grabbed my radio handset. "Dispatch, this is Unit 2847, I said. "I have a disabled motorist, mile marker 52, State Route 85, requesting supervisor response to my location. Static. Not the normal static of radio interference, but a layered, pulsing static that seemed to contain rhythms and patterns. I adjusted the frequency, checked the squelch, keyed the mic again. Dispatch, Unit 2847, radio check. More static, and beneath it, or maybe woven through it, I heard what sounded like voices. Not words, not exactly, but the cadence and rhythm of speech, coming from somewhere that wasn't my radio and wasn't anywhere in the visible landscape around me. I looked at my watch. 2:27 a.m. 8 minutes since I'd first stopped. I walked back to where Ms. Chen stood by her vehicle. She was watching me with an expression that suggested she already knew what I'd discovered. "Your radio doesn't work here, does it?" she said. "Not right now," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean what you're experiencing is what I'm experiencing." You're a cop, she said. You're trained to observe, to notice details. So I want you to do something for me. I want you to look at the mile markers. Really look at them. I turned and looked south. Down the highway. In the wash of my headlights and the glow from my light bar, I could see the road stretching away into darkness. Maybe 200 yards ahead, at the limit of my visibility, I could just make out a reflective green sign. Mile marker 53. I'm looking, I said. Now look at your odometer, she said. Tell me how far you've driven since you pulled over. I walked back to my patrol unit and checked the odometer. I'd driven 1.8 miles since passing through Ajo. According to my trip log, mile marker 52 was exactly where I should be based on that distance. Nothing unusual. I told her this. Okay, she said. Now I want you to drive to the next mile marker, just to 53. See what happens. I didn't like taking orders from a civilian, but her request was reasonable. I got in my unit, made sure Ms. Chen was safely back in her vehicle, and pulled onto the highway. I drove south, keeping my speed moderate, watching the odometer tick upward. 1.9 miles, 2.0 miles, 2.1 miles. The green sign grew larger in my headlights. Mile marker 53, exactly as expected. I drove past it, continued for another 1/10 of a mile, then turned around in the roadway and headed back north. As I passed the sign again, heading north now, I glanced at it. Mile marker 54. I stopped the vehicle. That wasn't right. The sign had read 53 when I passed it heading south. It should still read 53 when I passed it heading north, just from the opposite direction. I backed up, pulling alongside the sign, and examined it with my spotlight. The number was definitely 54. I drove south again, slowly, and watched the next sign appear in my headlights. Mile marker 55. I checked my odometer. Since passing what I'd thought was mile marker 53, I'd traveled 1.1 miles. That should have put me at marker 52. Instead, the markers were counting up, and they were appearing at intervals that didn't match the distances my vehicle was actually traveling. I drove back to where Ms. Chen was parked, my mind racing through possible explanations. Equipment malfunction, incorrect sign placement, fatigue-induced hallucination, anything that fit into a rational framework. When I pulled in behind her Nissan again, she was standing outside her vehicle, waiting. You see it now, she said. It wasn't a question. I see the mile markers appearing in the wrong order, I said carefully. But that doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. There could be explanations. Vandalism, signs placed incorrectly during maintenance. She shook her head. I thought that too, at first. But then I realized something else. She pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. No signal. That's normal. But look at the time. Her phone screen showed 11:47 p.m. That's wrong, I said. It's after 2 a.m. My phone has been counting backwards, she said. When I entered this stretch of highway at 10:30, my phone showed the correct time. But for every hour I've been driving, my phone has gone back an hour. It's not stuck, she added. The seconds still tick forward, but when a minute passes, the time display jumps backward 2 minutes. Net loss. 1 minute for every minute of real time. I looked at my own phone. 2:34 a.m., exactly matching my watch. I showed it to her. Mine's fine, I said. She looked at my phone, then back at hers, confusion crossing her face. That doesn't make sense, she said. Unless... She paused, looking around at the desert darkness surrounding us. Unless time is running differently for different objects, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Different rates for different frames of reference. She nodded slowly. I have a degree in computer science, she said. I took physics courses. What you're describing is relativistic time dilation, but that requires massive gravitational fields or velocities approaching the speed of light. We're standing still in the desert. I know, I said. I looked south, down the highway, then north. The landscape looked completely normal. Desert vegetation, distant mountains barely visible as darker masses against the night sky, stars overhead in their familiar patterns. Everything appeared exactly as it should, except for the impossible behavior of the mile markers and Ms. Chen's phone. We need to get you out of here, I said, making a decision. Follow me. We'll drive north together, back toward Ajo. If what you're experiencing is localized to this area, we should be able to exit the zone. She got in her car without argument, and I pulled back onto the highway, heading north. She followed close behind me, her headlights steady in my rearview mirror. I watched the mile markers as we drove. 54, 55, 56, 57. Still counting up despite our northward direction. After driving what my odometer indicated was 4.3 miles, I saw a sign ahead that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Mile marker 47. We'd reached the northern boundary of the zone Ms. Chen had described, but we'd approached it from the south, and the markers had continued their impossible ascent. I slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. Ms. Chen stopped behind me. When I got out and walked back to her car, she was staring at her phone. 10:15 p.m., she said, her voice hollow. I've gone back another hour. Check your phone, I said. She did. 2:51 a.m., consistent with the time that had passed since we started this experiment. 2 devices, I said, experiencing time at different rates in the same location, with no apparent cause. This isn't possible, she said, but her tone suggested she no longer believed that statement. I made a decision that probably violated a dozen department policies. Get out of your car, I said. Leave everything except your essentials. You're riding with me. We're going to drive north, past marker 47 together, in the same vehicle, and see what happens. She grabbed her purse and locked her Nissan, and we both got into my patrol unit. I made a U-turn and headed south. As we approached and passed mile marker 47, I felt something change. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden jolt or flash of light, but there was a subtle shift in the quality of the air, the sound, even the way the light from my headlights seemed to interact with the road ahead. The sensation reminded me of passing through a door into a room with different air pressure, that brief moment where your ears register a change even though everything appears identical. Ms. Chen felt it too. I saw her hand grip the door handle, her breathing quicken. Did you? She started to say. I felt it, I confirmed. I looked at my watch. Still 2:51 a.m. I glanced at her phone, which she held in her lap. 10:15 p.m., unchanged. We drove south in silence for several minutes. I kept my speed steady at 55 miles per hour, watching the mile markers appear and pass. 48, 49, 50, 51, all counting upward, all appearing at intervals that seemed random, sometimes after half a mile, sometimes after 2 miles, with no pattern I could discern. At what should have been mile marker 70, based on my odometer reading, I saw a sign ahead. But it wasn't a mile marker. It was a warning sign, the kind the highway department uses to alert drivers to upcoming conditions. But I'd never seen this particular sign on Route 85, and I'd driven this highway hundreds of times. The sign was standard Arizona highway sign design, reflective green with white letters, but the message was one I'd never encountered. Temporal gradient ahead. Reduce speed. Observe caution. I slowed the vehicle and stopped about 50 feet from the sign. Temporal gradient, Ms. Chen read aloud. That's not a standard road sign. No, I agreed. It's not. I got out of the vehicle and approached the sign on foot, my flashlight raised. As I got closer, I could see that the sign was genuine, not a prank or vandalism. The metal was standard highway department issue, properly mounted on a regulation post, with the kind of weathering you'd expect from years of desert exposure. But I'd never seen it before, and I'd passed this exact location countless times. I examined the area around the sign and noticed something else. About 20 feet east of the sign, set back from the road, was a small concrete structure, maybe 4 feet square and 3 feet high. It looked like a surveying monument or a utility access point, the kind of anonymous infrastructure that dots highways everywhere. But this one had markings I couldn't identify. I approached it carefully, aware that Ms. Chen was watching from the patrol unit. The concrete structure had a metal plate on top, and stamped into the metal were symbols that looked like a combination of mathematical notation and something else, something that didn't match any alphabet or notation system I recognized. I took out my phone and photographed the symbols, zooming in to capture as much detail as possible. When I returned to the vehicle, Ms. Chen was leaning over, looking at something on the dashboard. "Your odometer," she said. "Look at your odometer." I'd driven 23.7 miles since leaving Ajo according to my trip meter, but that couldn't be right. I'd only left Ajo about an hour and a half ago, and I'd been traveling at reasonable patrol speeds, stopping to investigate Ms. Chen's vehicle, conducting our experiments with the mile markers. 23.7 miles was roughly the correct distance from Ajo to mile marker 70, but I should have reached that point much earlier. "Check your fuel gauge," she said. I looked. I'd started my shift with a full tank. The gauge now read just over half full. That represented roughly 100 miles of driving, maybe more given idling time and the use of lights and equipment. But I'd only driven 23.7 miles, according to the odometer. The vehicle is experiencing different rates of fuel consumption and distance traveled, Ms. Chen said, her voice taking on a clinical tone, as if analyzing a software problem. "The odometer measures distance based on wheel rotations," she continued. "The fuel gauge measures consumption. If they're showing different ratios than normal, that suggests the physical processes of the engine and the measurement of distance are operating at different rates. Or the instruments are malfunctioning," I said, though I didn't believe it. She shook her head. "Not just the instruments? Me too. My phone, the mile markers, all showing time and distance behaving differently than they should. This isn't instrument error. This is something affecting reality itself in this location." I sat in the driver's seat, trying to process what we were experiencing. I'm a trained law enforcement officer. I've had crisis intervention training, field sobriety training. I understand how stress and fatigue can create perceptual distortions. But this was beyond any of that. The evidence was accumulating in ways that defied any rational explanation, except the one I didn't want to accept. "We need to find someone who knows what this is," Ms. Chen said. "Someone who's experienced it before. Because I guarantee you, we're not the first people this has happened to." I thought about the unwritten rule among highway patrol officers. Don't stop between markers 47 and 70 after dark. The rule existed for a reason, and now I was beginning to understand why. "I know someone," I said slowly, "a retired ranger who worked this area for 30 years. If anyone knows what's happening here, it's him. Ms. Chen looked at me hopefully. Can you reach him? Not from here, I said. We need to get out of this zone first. I put the vehicle in gear and turned around, heading north again. As we drove, I noticed something I'd missed before. The stars overhead were moving. Not the slow rotation you'd expect from Earth's movement, but noticeably faster, as if time in the sky was passing at an accelerated rate compared to time on the ground. I pointed this out to Ms. Chen, and she rolled down her window to look up. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Look at the Orion constellation." I knew where Orion should be at this time of year, in early October. It should be rising in the eastern sky after midnight, clearly visible by 3 a.m. But as I watched through the windshield, Orion was moving across the sky at a pace you could see with the naked eye, traveling from east to west in what appeared to be a time lapse of a full night's rotation. "How fast is it moving?" Ms. Chen asked, though she was already pulling out her phone to calculate. I focused on a specific star in the constellation's belt, timing its movement against the vehicle's digital clock. It crossed about 15 degrees of sky in what the clock indicated was 2 minutes. "That's impossibly fast," she said, working through calculations on her phone's calculator. "If stars are moving at that rate, it means time in the sky is passing roughly 180 times faster than time on the ground. Or time for us is passing 180 times slower than time in the normal world," I said quietly. The implications of that statement hung in the air between us. If we were experiencing time at a drastically reduced rate compared to the world around us, then every minute we spent in this zone represented hours passing outside it. I pushed the accelerator down, increasing our speed. My training screamed at me not to speed on an unfamiliar highway at night. But if we were caught in some kind of temporal distortion field, getting out of it as quickly as possible seemed more important than following normal speed limits. We passed the sign reading mile marker 47, again approaching it from the south, despite our northward travel. As we crossed what should have been the northern boundary of the affected zone, I felt that same subtle shift, like passing through an invisible membrane. And then everything changed. The sensation was immediate and dramatic. The air suddenly felt normal, the proper temperature and density. The stars overhead stopped their impossible race across the sky, resuming their usual imperceptible movement, and my radio came alive with a burst of static followed by a dispatcher's voice. "Unit 2847. Unit 2847. Please respond. We've been trying to reach you for 6 hours. What is your status?" I grabbed the handset, my hand shaking slightly. "Dispatch, this is 2847. I'm northbound on Route 85, just north of mile marker 47, with a civilian passenger. I'm code 4. No assistance needed at this time, but I need to call in a supervisor." "Unit 2847. The dispatcher's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, a mixture of relief and anger. "You've been out of contact since 2:19 a.m. It's now 8:47 a.m. Please confirm you are uninjured and provide your exact location." I looked at my watch. It read 3:03 a.m. I looked at the vehicle's clock. 3:03 a.m. I looked at Ms. Chen's phone. 3:03 a.m. The phone that had been counting backwards was now synchronized with everything else. "Dispatch," I said carefully. "My clock shows 3:03 a.m. Please confirm your time check." There was a pause. "Unit 2847, the dispatcher said, her voice now officially concerned. "Our time is 8:47 a.m., November 14th. "Please confirm. Did you say November?" I interrupted. "Ma'am, it's October 14th, negative 2847. Today is November 14th. You have been offline and unresponsive for 1 month. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Ms. Chen made a small sound beside me, somewhere between a gasp and a moan. 1 month, she whispered. We were in there for 1 month. But it felt like less than 2 hours, I said. Dispatch, I need you to send a supervisor to my location immediately, and I need you to contact. I gave her the name and number of the retired ranger I'd thought of earlier. Tell him Trooper Webb needs to speak with him urgently about Route 85. Unit 2847, a supervisor is already en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. I'll attempt to contact your requested party. Do you require medical assistance? Negative, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. I'm physically unharmed, but I have a civilian with me who's been... I paused, trying to figure out how to phrase this in a way that wouldn't get me immediately ordered in for a psychological evaluation, who's been experiencing the same temporal anomaly I have. I pulled onto the shoulder and put the vehicle in park. Ms. Chen was staring at her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were messages and notifications that had accumulated during the missing month. I have 847 unread emails, she said, her voice distant and shocked. My boss has sent me 23 messages asking where I am. My rent autopay has bounced twice. My bank has flagged my account for potential fraud because my car hasn't been seen at any gas stations or toll plazas in 30 days. Ms. Chen, I said gently, trying to get her to focus on me rather than the phone. I need you to stay calm. We're going to figure this out. She looked up at me, and I saw tears starting to form in her eyes. Figure it out, she said, her voice rising slightly. I've lost a month of my life. I'm probably fired from my job. My family probably thinks I'm dead. And according to my phone and your dispatch, we just spent 30 days in a 20-mile stretch of highway. But for us, it felt like 2 hours. How do you figure that out? I didn't have a good answer. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I need you to write down everything you remember from tonight, I said. Every detail, exact times according to your perception, what you saw, what you felt, while it's still fresh in your memory. She nodded, pulled a notebook from her purse, and started writing with shaking hands. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked back south, down Route 85 toward the section of highway we'd just escaped. In the growing light of morning, because it was morning now, even though my subjective experience said it was the middle of the night, the desert looked completely normal. The highway stretched away into the distance, heat mirages already beginning to form, even though the air temperature was probably only in the 60s, if those were heat mirages. Now, I couldn't be sure of anything I was seeing. A patrol vehicle appeared from the north, lights flashing, and pulled to a stop in front of my unit. My supervisor, Sergeant Rodriguez, got out and walked back to where I stood. He was a 20-year veteran, a man I respected and who I knew respected me. But the look on his face was one I'd never seen before. It was the expression of someone who was deeply relieved and deeply angry at the same time. Webb, he said, do you have any idea what you've put us through? 1 month. 1 month you've been missing. We've had search and rescue teams. We've had aircraft. We've had federal agencies involved. Your wife has been beside herself. Your kids have been asking when Daddy is coming home. And now you show up, looking like you just started your shift, telling dispatch it's October, when it's the middle of November, talking about temporal anomalies. What the hell happened to you? I took a breath and made a decision that I knew would probably end my career. "Sergeant," I said, "I need you to look at my patrol unit." Rodriguez frowned, but walked to my vehicle and looked it over. "What am I looking for?" he asked. "The condition," I said, "the mileage, the fuel level, the date of the last maintenance sticker." He examined the vehicle more carefully, and I saw his expression change. "Webb," he said slowly, "this vehicle looks like it just came out of the motor pool. The tires aren't worn, the paint isn't faded, the interior doesn't show a month's worth of use." He checked the odometer through the driver's window. "You've got 89,247 miles showing." I pulled out my trip log, the paper record I'd filled out at the start of my shift. "According to this log, I started my shift tonight with 89,231 miles. I've driven 16 miles since then." Rodriguez pulled out his own phone and made a call. He spoke quietly for a moment, then returned. "According to Fleet Services," he said, "your vehicle has been missing along with you. They reported it had 89,231 miles when you started your last shift on October 14th. So either you've only driven 16 miles in a month, or time for your vehicle has been passing at a very different rate than time for the rest of the world." "The rest of the world," I said. "Not me, not the vehicle, not Ms. Chen." Rodriguez looked past me to where Ms. Chen sat in the passenger seat of my unit. "Who is she?" I explained briefly about stopping to help her, about the mile markers, about the impossible behavior of time and space in the zone between markers 47 and 70. As I talked, I watched Rodriguez's face cycle through disbelief, concern, and finally a resigned acceptance. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "There's something you need to know," he finally said. "You're not the first." He gestured for me to follow him to his vehicle. From the trunk, he pulled out a file folder, the kind used for physical case files that are too sensitive for digital storage. He opened it and showed me the contents. Reports, dozens of them, dating back years. Missing persons reports for drivers on Route 85. Incident reports from troopers describing strange experiences, technology failures, mile markers appearing in the wrong order, and a handwritten note clipped to the top of the pile that made my blood run cold. The note was dated 1957, written on Arizona Highway Patrol letterhead, signed by a patrol captain whose name I didn't recognize. It read, "To whoever assumes responsibility for the Route 85 anomaly. This phenomenon has been observed since at least 1945, possibly earlier based on tribal accounts. It appears to be a zone of temporal distortion centered approximately between mile markers 47 and 70. Effects include time dilation, spatial distortion, technology malfunctions, and missing persons. No fatalities have been confirmed, but 23 individuals have entered the zone and never emerged. 7 individuals have emerged after varying periods, all reporting subjective time experiences much shorter than actual elapsed time. The longest case involved a subject who entered the zone in 1952 and emerged in 1955, believing only 36 hours had passed. Do not attempt containment or investigation without proper authorization. This matter falls under Atomic Energy Act classification. Further inquiries should be directed to the Department of Energy Office of Environmental Management." The note was stamped with a classification marking I recognized from my time in the Army before joining the Highway Patrol. It was a Department of Energy Security classification, the kind used for nuclear weapons sites and certain other sensitive facilities. "Rodriguez," I said, "why are you showing me this?" "Because you're going to be asked to sign paperwork," he said quietly. non-disclosure agreements. You're going to be debriefed by people who aren't from our department, and you need to understand what you've stumbled into before that happens. He pulled out another document, this one more recent, dated 2019. It was a memorandum from the Arizona Department of Public Safety to all officers working southern routes. The memo was brief and bureaucratic, but its meaning was clear. Officers were advised to avoid stopping in the specified zone after dark unless absolutely necessary, to respond to calls in that area in pairs, to report any unusual experiences immediately through specific channels, and to be aware that technology malfunctions were common in that region due to geological electromagnetic anomalies. They're covering it up, I said. Rodriguez shook his head. Not covering up. Managing. There's a difference. Whatever is happening in that zone has been happening for at least 80 years, probably longer. The government knows about it. They study it. But they can't explain it. They can't stop it. And they can't tell the public about it without causing panic. So they manage it. They monitor it. They try to keep people out of the affected area. And when someone like you or Ms. Chen stumbles into it and comes back out, they make sure the information stays contained. What about the people who don't come back out? I asked. The 23 individuals mentioned in that note? Rodriguez closed the file. I don't know. Nobody knows. Maybe they're still in there, experiencing time at such a slow rate that they won't emerge for decades or centuries. Maybe they found a way out in a different time or place. Maybe they're dead. We don't have answers. Before I could respond, another vehicle approached from the north. This one wasn't a patrol unit. It was a dark SUV with government plates, and as it pulled to a stop, two people in civilian clothes got out. They looked like federal agents, and as they approached, one of them pulled out identification. Trooper Webb, the woman said. I'm Dr. Sarah Martinez with the Department of Energy. This is Agent Chen with Homeland Security. We need you and your passenger to come with us. Not arrested, she clarified, seeing my expression. Debriefed. We have medical facilities standing by to check you both over, and we have questions about your experience. This is voluntary, Agent Chen added, but I strongly encourage your cooperation. The alternative is we classify your experience, and you're prohibited from discussing it with anyone, including your family, without even understanding what happened to you. I looked back at my patrol unit, where Ms. Chen was still writing in her notebook. Do I have a choice? I asked. You always have a choice, Dr. Martinez said. But if you choose not to cooperate, you'll never get answers. And based on the preliminary data from our monitoring stations, something in that zone is becoming more active. The temporal gradients are increasing. If we don't figure out what's happening and why, more people are going to get caught in it. I made my decision. I'll cooperate, I said, but I want answers. Real answers, not classifications and NDAs and bureaucratic runarounds. Dr. Martinez nodded. I'll tell you what I can. That's the best I can offer. The next 6 hours were spent in a facility I can't describe, in a location I'm not allowed to disclose. Ms. Chen and I were separated, examined by doctors, questioned by scientists and intelligence analysts. My blood was drawn, my brain activity monitored, my story recorded in excruciating detail. I was shown photographs of the concrete structure I'd found near the temporal gradient sign, shown documents about the history of the anomaly, shown readings from instruments I didn't understand, measuring phenomena I couldn't comprehend. What I learned during that debriefing changed my understanding of reality. The Route 85 anomaly, they told me, is one of approximately 40 known temporal distortion zones in the United States. Most are in remote areas, places where few people travel. They're apparently natural phenomena, though the word natural doesn't quite capture what they are. The scientists I spoke with had theories. Exotic matter creating localized gravitational distortions. Intersections between our dimension and others where the laws of physics are different. Residual effects from the testing of nuclear weapons at nearby sites. But they admitted they don't really know. What they do know is that the zones are expanding. The Route 85 anomaly was originally maybe 2 miles across when it was first documented in the 1940s. Now, it's 23 miles long and growing. The temporal dilation effect is intensifying. In 1952, time inside the zone passed at roughly 1/30th normal rate. Now it's closer to 1/200th. If the trend continues, they told me, in another decade the zone could trap people for centuries while they experience only days. They showed me data from other zones. One in Alaska, where time passes faster inside the zone, where people age years in what they perceive as weeks. One in Nevada, where time appears to flow backwards, creating causality paradoxes that they still can't explain. One in Louisiana, where the anomaly is three-dimensional, affecting not just the horizontal surface, but extending deep underground, creating spaces that are larger on the inside than the outside. And they told me about the people who don't come back. Some of them, Dr. Martinez explained, may have encountered what they call temporal horizons, points where the time dilation becomes so extreme that they effectively freeze from the perspective of the outside world. A person who crosses a temporal horizon experiences time normally, but from the outside, they appear to move slower and slower, like something falling into a black hole, until they're effectively frozen in a single instant that will last for millions of years. Others may have found exits that lead to different times. The mathematics of extreme time dilation allows for the possibility of closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves. Someone entering the zone might exit not just in a different location, but in a different era, past or future. One researcher I spoke with, a physicist whose name I was told to forget, said something that has stayed with me. These zones, he said, are teaching us that time isn't what we think it is. We imagine time as a river, flowing in one direction, carrying us from past to future. But these anomalies suggest time is more like a web, with multiple threads connecting different moments, different possibilities. Some threads are strong, creating the experience of linear time we're used to. Others are weak, creating zones where time behaves strangely. And some threads loop back on themselves, creating the possibility of travel not just through time, but between different timelines, different versions of reality. After the debriefing, I was released with a stack of paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, medical release forms, documentation that I was fit to return to duty, but recommended for administrative leave while I processed my experience. Ms. Chen received similar treatment. We were both told that we could discuss our experience with designated counselors and medical professionals, but not with media, not with our families beyond the bare minimum, not with anyone who didn't have the proper security clearances. I returned home to find my wife and children aged a month older than when I'd left for my shift. My son had lost his first tooth. My daughter had learned to ride her bike without training wheels. These small milestones of childhood that I'd missed because I'd been caught in a fold in time. When I tried to explain what had happened, I found I couldn't. The words felt wrong, inadequate. How do you tell your family that you lost a month of time? That you were only a few miles away the entire time but unreachable, experiencing a different flow of temporal reality? I settled for telling my wife that I'd been involved in a classified incident, that I was fine, that I couldn't discuss details. She accepted this with the patience of someone married to a law enforcement officer for 10 years, someone who understood that sometimes the job involves things that can't be talked about. But I could see the questions in her eyes, the concern, the fear that I'd brought something home with me from wherever I'd been. And she was right to be concerned, because I had brought something back. At first, I thought it was just stress, the psychological aftermath of a traumatic experience. But about a week after my return, I started noticing things. Small things, easy to dismiss. Clocks that seemed to run at slightly different speeds. My watch gaining a few seconds here, losing a few seconds there. The digital clock on the microwave running fast. The clock on my truck running slow. Shadows falling at angles that didn't quite match the position of the sun. I'd be standing in my yard in mid-afternoon, sun clearly in the western sky, but my shadow stretched toward the west as if the sun was behind me. Time displayed on my phone sometimes didn't match time displayed on my truck dashboard, even though both were set to auto-update from network time. The differences were small, never more than a minute or two, but they were consistent, and they were wrong. I started documenting these discrepancies, keeping a log of every time I noticed something off, and I noticed a pattern. The discrepancies were worse when I was tired, when I was stressed, when I was distracted. As if whatever I'd been exposed to in the Route 85 anomaly had left some kind of mark on me, some residual effect that influenced my perception of time, or maybe influenced time itself around me. I reached out to the retired ranger whose name I'd given to dispatch during my incident. His name was Thomas Whitehorse, and he'd worked the southern Arizona parks and highways for 34 years before retiring in 2018. When I called him and explained who I was and what had happened, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You entered the zone." Not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said, "and you came back out." His voice carried a weight I couldn't quite identify. Most people who go in deep enough don't come back, or they come back wrong. "What does that mean, coming back wrong?" I asked. "It means what's happening to you now," he said. "The time perception issues, the shadows, the feeling that you're not quite synchronized with the rest of the world anymore." He invited me to meet him at his home on the Tohono O'Odham Nation, land that borders the western edge of Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. When I arrived, he was sitting on his porch, a man in his late 60s with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to look past surfaces into deeper truths. He offered me coffee, and we sat in silence for a few minutes before he spoke. "My grandfather," he said, "told me about a place the old ones called the Wound, a place where the skin of the world is torn, where time bleeds through from other whens and wheres. He said the Wound has always been there, long before the white men came, long before the Spanish, probably since the mountains were young." "Your Route 85 anomaly," I said. He nodded. "The highway just happens to run through it, but the Wound itself is older than roads, older than nations." He told me stories passed down through generations, stories of people who wandered into the wound and returned days later speaking of years that passed, stories of hunters who tracked game into the affected area and emerged to find their families aged to death, their children grown old, their world transformed by decades they never experienced. But there were other stories too, he said. Stories of people who learned to navigate the wound, who understood its nature well enough to use it. Time walkers, we called them. People who could step between moments, who existed partially in multiple whens simultaneously. Some became healers, using their ability to see multiple timelines to choose the best outcome for the sick. Others became warnings, showing people what would happen if they continued down certain paths. And some, he said, his voice dropping, became guardians. They gave up their linear existence, chose to exist in the liminal space between normal time and the wound's time, serving as bridges. Warning travelers, guiding the lost, maintaining the boundary between what is and what could be. Is that what's happening to me? I asked. Am I becoming a guardian? Whitehorse looked at me with those deep eyes. You were marked, he said. When you spent time in the wound, it recognized something in you. Some quality, some openness, and it left part of itself in you. Now, you're becoming a bridge. You'll find you can sense the wound from far away. You'll know when it's active, when it's growing. You'll feel when someone enters it and becomes lost. What am I supposed to do with that? I asked. What did the others do? He shrugged. Some fought it, tried to return to normal life. It drove them mad, feeling time split around them, seeing shadows of other moments bleeding through. Others accepted it, learned to work with it. They became the unwritten rule you followed, the reason troopers avoid the zone after dark. They became the people who maintain the warning signs, who watch over the boundary, who try to guide others away from the danger. It's your choice, he said. But know that the choice is really only about whether you fight what you're becoming or accept it. You can't go back to what you were before you entered the wound. That version of you, the one who experienced time as a simple linear flow, who trusted that clocks measured something objective and real. That version died in the zone. What emerged is something different. Before I left his porch that evening, Whitehorse handed me something wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was a small leather journal, its pages brittle with age, filled with handwritten entries in multiple languages. Some Spanish from the colonial period, some in English from the territorial days, some in what I recognized as Tohono O'odham script. This belonged to my grandfather, Whitehorse said. He was one of the guardians. He kept records of everyone who entered the wound during his lifetime, what happened to them, what he learned about the zone's behavior. He wanted future guardians to understand they weren't alone, that this responsibility has been passed down for generations. I spent the next 2 weeks reading through that journal whenever I had time. The entries painted a picture of the wound's history that was both fascinating and terrifying. The earliest entry I could date with certainty was from 1881, written in Spanish by a man who identified himself as a surveyor working for the U.S. government. He described encountering a section of desert where his instruments gave impossible readings, where his pocket watch ran backwards, where he and his team lost 3 days but experienced only hours. The surveyor wrote that local indigenous people warned him the land was sacred, forbidden, that it belonged to the spirits who walked between worlds. he ignored the warnings and pressed on, trying to map the zone's boundaries. Of his 6-man team, only 3 emerged. The other 3, according to his account, walked into a region where the air itself seemed to ripple and fold, and they simply disappeared. The surveyor waited for 2 weeks, but his men never returned. When he finally left the area and returned to civilization, he discovered that the 2 weeks he'd waited had actually been 6 months. His family had given him up for dead. His position with the survey team had been filled. His life had moved on without him. There were entries from the 1920s during Prohibition, describing bootleggers who tried to use the wound as a hiding place, thinking the temporal distortions would protect them from federal agents. Some of those bootleggers never came back out. Others emerged decades later, having aged only days, their hidden caches of illegal alcohol now historical artifacts. One entry from 1945, written in careful English by Whitehorse's grandfather, described watching from a distance as a military convoy approached the wound. This was during the early days of atomic weapons testing in Nevada and New Mexico, and there was speculation among the Tohono O'odham elders that the government was deliberately testing how nuclear radiation interacted with the temporal anomaly. The convoy consisted of 3 trucks and approximately 20 soldiers. Whitehorse's grandfather watched as the convoy entered the zone and vanished. He camped at the boundary for 2 weeks, waiting to see if they would emerge. On the 14th day, a single soldier walked out of the wound alone. The man was elderly, at least 70 years old, though according to the military records Whitehorse's grandfather later accessed, the entire convoy had been staffed by soldiers in their 20s and 30s. The elderly soldier spoke to Whitehorse's grandfather before dying of what appeared to be extreme old age. He said that inside the wound, the convoy had encountered a version of the zone where time flowed at a massively accelerated rate. What had been 2 weeks for Whitehorse's grandfather had been 47 years for the soldier. His companions had all died of old age, one by one, until he alone remained. He'd spent decades trying to find a way out, watching the desert beyond the boundary, but unable to cross back into normal time. When he finally did emerge, his body, which had aged normally within the wound's accelerated time, couldn't handle the shock of returning to normal temporal flow. He died within hours. The entry that affected me most was dated September 1972. Whitehorse's grandfather described meeting a young woman named Sarah Benally, a Navajo nurse who'd been driving Route 85 when her car broke down in the zone. She'd walked into the wound looking for help and had spent what she experienced as 3 days wandering in a landscape that shifted and changed around her. When she finally emerged, 6 years had passed in the outside world. Her husband had remarried, believing her dead. Her children had been raised by relatives. Her job, her home, her entire life was gone. Whitehorse's grandfather had tried to help her adjust, but the trauma of losing 6 years, combined with the ongoing temporal sensitivity she'd developed, proved too much. She took her own life 3 months after emerging from the wound. The final entry in the journal was dated 2017, written by Whitehorse himself. He described feeling the wound expanding, its boundaries pushing outward, the temporal gradients intensifying. He wrote about a theory that the anomaly was feeding on something, growing stronger with each person who entered and became trapped in its temporal flows. He worried that eventually the wound would expand beyond the ability of anyone to contain it, that it would swallow larger and larger sections of Arizona until time itself broke down across the entire region. And he wrote about the guardians, the ones who'd been marked and chose to stay to serve as bridges. He estimated there had been perhaps 40 guardians over the past century, people who'd been changed by the wound and dedicated their remaining years to protecting others from its effects. Most eventually crossed a threshold they couldn't return from, disappearing into the zone's deeper layers where time spiraled in ways that severed all connection to normal reality. A few, like him, retired from active guardianship, but remained sensitive to the wound's presence, able to feel its pulses and changes even from a distance. I left Whitehorse's home with more questions than answers, but at least now I understood what was happening to me. The time perception issues weren't psychological trauma. They were real, physical effects of my exposure to the anomaly. I was becoming something in between, someone who existed partially in normal time and partially in the strange temporal flows of the wound. And I wasn't the first. I was part of a lineage stretching back at least a century, probably longer, of people who'd been marked and chosen to serve. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. Over the following weeks, the effects intensified. I found I could sometimes perceive events slightly before they happened, sensing a car running a red light a second before it entered the intersection, knowing my phone would ring moments before it did. Nothing dramatic, just a slight temporal offset, like watching a movie where the audio is a fraction of a second ahead of the video. And I started to feel the wound itself, even from a distance. When I was in Phoenix, over 100 miles north of Route 85, I could sense its presence, like a cold spot in my awareness, a place where time bent and folded. The sensation grew stronger over time, until I could map the anomaly's boundaries without instruments, feeling the edges of the zone where normal time gave way to distorted flows. 3 months after my initial experience, I was contacted by Dr. Martinez again. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve as a consultant, someone who could help them understand the wound from the inside, someone who could potentially enter the zone and return, using my newfound sensitivity to map its internal structure, to understand how time was flowing within it. The pay would be significant. The risks would be enormous. I'd be entering a place where the normal rules of causality didn't apply, where I might age years in subjective hours or lose decades of time in what felt like moments. But I'd also be helping them understand something that threatened to expand and consume more of the world with each passing year. I accepted. Not for the money, though that helped my family deal with the financial stress of my lost month. I accepted because I'd been marked, because I'd become something different, and that difference came with responsibility. If I could help prevent what happened to me from happening to others, if I could help understand and maybe eventually contain the wound, then my transformation would have meaning. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've entered the Route 85 anomaly 5 times. Each time, I go a little deeper, stay a little longer, map a little more of its internal structure. Each time, I come back changed a little more, a little less synchronized with normal time, a little more able to perceive the web of moments that underlies reality. The first expedition, after my initial accidental encounter, was the hardest. Dr. Martinez and her team had equipped me with instruments designed to measure temporal flow, electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and a dozen other variables I barely understood. I wore a specially designed suit with sensors embedded in the fabric, carried cameras that recorded at multiple frame rates simultaneously, and had a tether attached to my waist, a physical cable that extended back to the research station they'd established at mile marker 47. The tether wasn't for pulling me back out, they'd explained. It was for maintaining a connection to normal time, a literal anchor that might prevent me from drifting too deep into the wound's temporal currents. I entered the zone at 3 p.m. on a clear March afternoon, walking south from mile marker 47 along the highway shoulder. The boundary was invisible but unmistakable. One moment, I was in normal desert afternoon, sun hot on my shoulders, air dry and still. The next moment, I'd crossed into the affected area and everything changed. The temperature dropped about 15 degrees in the span of a single step. The quality of light shifted, becoming slightly more blue, as if I was seeing the world through a filter. And my perception of time, already sensitized by my previous exposure, immediately registered the change. Time was flowing slower here, maybe at a rate of 1/150th normal flow, based on the instruments I carried. I could feel my heartbeat, strong and regular in my chest, but when I looked at my watch, the second hand was crawling around the dial, each tick taking what felt like several seconds. I walked deeper into the zone, paying careful attention to the sensations, trying to catalog everything I experienced. At roughly mile marker 50, I encountered the first major anomaly. There was a cactus, a large saguaro, growing on the west side of the highway. Saguaros can live for 150 to 200 years, growing slowly in the harsh desert environment. This particular cactus appeared to be in two states simultaneously. Part of it was young, maybe 20 years old, just beginning to develop its first arms. Part of it was ancient, perhaps 180 years old, massive and scarred by decades of storms. The two states existed in the same space, overlapping, as if I was seeing the cactus as it had been and as it would become, both versions equally real. I photographed it from multiple angles, and when I reviewed the images later, the effect was visible on camera, though less dramatic than what I perceived directly. The research team was fascinated. This was visual confirmation of something they'd theorized, that inside the wound, different temporal states could coexist, that the normal linear progression from past to future broke down into a kind of quantum superposition, where multiple times occupied the same space. At mile marker 52, where I'd first encountered Ms. Chen, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a patrol vehicle parked on the shoulder, exactly where I'd parked my own unit 6 months earlier. But it wasn't my vehicle. It was an older model, mid-1990s vintage, based on the design, and it was in a state of advanced decay. The tires were flat and rotted, the paint was faded and peeling, rust had eaten through the body panels. I approached carefully, checking my instruments. The temporal flow around the vehicle was chaotic, fluctuating wildly. One moment, time seemed to flow forward at normal rate. The next, it reversed. The next, it stopped entirely. I peered through the driver's window and saw a skeleton in the driver's seat, still wearing the remnants of an Arizona Highway Patrol uniform. The badge number was still visible on the shirt pocket, 1847. The same number sequence as my own badge, but 1,000 units earlier, representing an officer who would have served perhaps 20 or 30 years before me. On the passenger seat was a logbook, partially decomposed, but still legible. I carefully opened the door, which crumbled at the hinges, and retrieved the logbook. The final entry was dated October 13th, 1987, almost exactly 36 years before my own first encounter with the wound. The officer, a trooper, David Richardson, had written 11:47 p.m. Stopped to investigate disabled vehicle, mile marker 52. Driver reports temporal anomalies, mile markers counting in wrong direction. Investigating further. Radio is malfunctioning. Will attempt to guide civilian out of affected area. 12:03 a.m. Time discrepancy observed. Vehicle clock shows 12:03. Civilian's watch shows 9:15 p.m. Unable to explain. 12:15 a.m. Attempted to exit zone northbound. Mile markers continue counting upward regardless of direction. Fuel gauge dropping faster than expected. 1:30 a.m. Lost visual contact with civilian vehicle. Searching on foot. Temperature fluctuation severe. Compass not functioning correctly. 2 a.m. Found civilian vehicle abandoned. No sign of driver. Blood on driver's seat. Trail leads south into desert. Following. 2:45 a.m. Trail has disappeared. Footprints seem to lead in multiple directions simultaneously, including backwards along path I just walked. Return to patrol vehicle. 3:33 a.m. Something is wrong with time here. My watch shows 3:33, but vehicle clock shows 1:47. Sky shows stars in wrong positions. Orion is visible but in summer position, wrong for October. 4:00 a.m. Have been trying to radio dispatch for 2 hours. No response. Can hear voices and static but cannot make out words. Am conserving fuel, but gauge continues to drop. Will wait for daylight before attempting exit again. The entry stopped there. Trooper Richardson had waited for a daylight that never came, or if it did come, came at such a slow rate relative to his perception that he aged and died before the sun rose. I stood there for a long time, looking at the remains of a brother officer who'd encountered the same phenomenon I had, but who hadn't made it out. There was no civilian vehicle nearby, no sign of the driver he'd been trying to help. Either they'd escaped through some other route, or they were still in the wound somewhere, lost in a temporal eddy. I took the logbook, carefully preserving it as evidence. I took photographs of the scene, and I marked the location on my GPS, though I knew the coordinates wouldn't make sense when viewed on a normal map. When I emerged from the zone 3 hours later, subjective time, the research team told me I'd been gone for 12 days. 12 days during which they'd monitored my vital signs through the tether sensors, watched the data streaming back, showing impossible readings, temporal gradients that fluctuated wildly, electromagnetic fields that pulsed in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I'd aged 3 hours. The world had aged 12 days. And I'd brought back proof that others had entered the wound before me, that at least some of them had died there, lost in temporal flows they couldn't navigate. The second expedition took me deeper. This time, I went past mile marker 60, into regions that the monitoring equipment suggested had even more severe temporal distortions. The landscape began to change in subtle ways. I'd see rock formations that I knew from geological surveys didn't exist in this area. Ancient wind-carved stone that should have been hundreds of miles away in different formations. I'd see vegetation from different eras. Extinct species of plants that hadn't grown in Arizona for 10,000 years, existing alongside modern desert flora. And I started to see the people. Not clearly, not like solid physical beings, but more like after-images, or echoes. Translucent figures walking along the highway, driving vehicles that flickered between different models and years, existing in multiple time periods simultaneously. Most of them didn't seem aware of me, but some turned and looked directly at me with eyes that held a terrible knowledge. One woman, appearing to be in her 50s, dressed in clothing from the 1960s, walked up to me and spoke. Her voice came to me not as sound, but as pressure, vibrations that I felt more than heard. "You're new," she said, still mostly anchored to the linear flow. "Be careful how deep you go." Some of us went too deep and couldn't find our way back to when we started. I tried to respond, to ask her who she was, how long she'd been here, but my voice didn't seem to work correctly in her temporal state. When I spoke, she flinched as if I'd shouted, even though to my own ears I was speaking normally. Slowly, I said, exaggerating each word, "Who are you?" "Margaret Chen," she said, and I recognized the last name. Any relation to the Ms. Chen I'd encountered? The woman seemed to understand my question without me voicing it. "My daughter," she said. "She entered the wound looking for me." "Did she find you?" I asked. "No," Margaret said. "We exist in different temporal layers. She passed through here, but in a different when than the when I occupy. I felt her presence, knew she was searching, but I couldn't reach her. Tell her, if you see her in the normal time, tell her I'm not lost. I'm just elsewhere. When is elsewhere?" I promised I would tell her. Margaret looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and understanding. "You're going to become one of us eventually," she said. "The wound marks certain people who have a natural sensitivity to temporal flow. Once you've been marked, you start to exist in multiple whens. Eventually, you'll spread across so many different temporal states that you won't have a single continuous experience anymore. You'll be like us, living all your moments simultaneously, experiencing your entire timeline as a single eternal now." "Is that what happened to you?" I asked. "I chose it," she said. "After I'd been wandering the wound for what felt like months, I realized I could let go of linear time entirely. I could stop fighting the temporal currents and just exist in all the moments at once. It's peaceful, in a way, confusing and overwhelming at first, but peaceful once you accept it." "How long have you been here?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "All of it," she said. "I entered in 1978, and I'll emerge in 2047. I've been here for 69 years, and I've been here for no time at all. Those statements are equally true from where I stand now." I wanted to ask more, but Margaret was already fading, her image becoming less substantial, as if she was drifting into a different temporal frequency. Before she disappeared entirely, she raised her hand in a gesture that might have been warning or farewell, and then she was gone. I completed that second expedition and emerged having been gone, according to the outside world, for 18 days. I'd subjectively experienced about 7 hours. The data I brought back showed that the deeper regions of the wound contained temporal currents flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, creating a kind of temporal turbulence where past, present, and future mixed together in ways that violated every known law of physics. The third expedition was when I started to understand the true nature of the wound. Deep in the zone, past mile marker 65, I found what the research team later called the core. It was a region, roughly a quarter-mile in diameter, where the temporal distortions reached their maximum intensity. Inside the core, time didn't flow in any direction. It existed as a kind of static field, all moments present simultaneously, past and future overlapping in the same space. I could see, actually see, the entire history of the desert laid out before me like a map. I saw the ancient seas that covered this region millions of years ago, saw the mountains rise and erode, saw the first humans arrive and establish territories, saw the Spanish conquistadors march through, saw the American settlers, saw the highway being built in the 1950s, saw cars traveling it across decades, saw the future development that hadn't happened yet, but would, saw the wound itself expanding and consuming more of the landscape until, in one possible future, it covered hundreds of square miles. And at the center of the core, I found what might have caused the wound in the first place. There was a structure, clearly artificial, clearly not human. It was made of a material that looked like stone, but wasn't. Something that existed in multiple states of solid and liquid and gas simultaneously. The structure was roughly pyramidal, maybe 30 feet tall, covered in markings that reminded me of the symbols I'd seen on the concrete monument during my first encounter. The research team's instruments went wild when I approached it, recording energy signatures they couldn't classify, gravitational anomalies that shouldn't be possible, and temporal readings that suggested the structure was both incredibly ancient and newly created, as if it existed outside normal causality entirely. I spent what felt like an hour studying the structure, photographing it from every angle, trying to understand its purpose. And as I studied it, I began to perceive something. Not exactly a message, not words or images, but more like a direct understanding that emerged in my consciousness. The structure was an anchor, a device deliberately placed to create the temporal distortion. It was generating the wound, had been generating it for a very long time, possibly thousands of years. And its purpose wasn't random. It was creating a sanctuary, a place where linear time broke down, where consciousness could exist in expanded states, where the rigid causality of normal reality gave way to something more fluid and free. Whether it was built by humans from a forgotten civilization or by something non-human, I couldn't determine. But it was clearly intentional, clearly designed, and clearly still functioning according to its original purpose. When I emerged from that third expedition, 23 days had passed in the outside world. I'd subjectively experienced perhaps 5 hours, and I brought back something the research team had never seen before. Clear photographic evidence of the core structure, proof that the wound wasn't a natural phenomenon, but something deliberately created and maintained. Dr. Martinez's reaction to the photographs was a mixture of excitement and concern. "This changes everything," she said. "If the anomaly is artificial, if it's being generated by technology, or something like technology, then it might be possible to shut it down, or at least control it. But the bigger question is, why would anyone or anything create a temporal distortion zone? What's its purpose?" I shared with her what I'd perceived in the core, the sense that the wound was meant to be a sanctuary, a place outside normal time. She listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "We've found similar structures at 3 other temporal anomaly sites," she finally said. "One in Alaska, one in Louisiana, one in Nevada. All of them have the same basic characteristics: pyramidal shape, unknown material, covered in mathematical or symbolic markings. We've been calling them anchors. We think they're part of a network, a system of temporal distortion zones distributed across the country, possibly across the world." "Who built them?" I asked. "We don't know," she admitted. "The best estimate from our archaeologists is that they're at least 10,000 years old, possibly much older. They predate every known civilization in the Americas. But whoever or whatever built them had a sophisticated understanding of physics that we're only beginning to approach. The fourth and fifth expeditions took me even deeper into the wound, into regions where the temporal distortions were so severe that I could feel myself beginning to fragment, my consciousness spreading across multiple time periods simultaneously. I met more of the lost ones, people like Margaret Chen, who'd given up their connection to linear time and now existed in expanded temporal states. Some of them had been in the wound for decades of outside time, experiencing it as days or weeks. Others had been there for days of outside time, but experienced decades. A few had reached states where they perceived their entire lifetime simultaneously, existing as four-dimensional beings for whom past and future were as accessible as left and right. And I began to understand why some people became guardians. It wasn't just about protecting others from the wound's dangers. It was about helping those who were ready to make the choice, who were prepared to give up linear existence for something larger and stranger. The guardians served as guides, helping people navigate the transition from sequential consciousness to expanded awareness, making sure those who crossed the deeper thresholds did so knowingly and willingly rather than accidentally. I met one guardian during my fifth expedition, an elderly man who appeared to be in his 80s, but who told me he'd been serving for over 100 years, aging much more slowly inside the wound's temporal flows. His name was Joshua Klein, and he'd entered the zone in 1923 as a young surveyor. He'd been marked, had chosen to stay, and had spent the subsequent century helping others understand and navigate the temporal anomalies. The wound is growing, he told me. The anchors are becoming more active, generating stronger distortions. We don't know why, but the effect is measurable. In another decade or two, this zone might expand to cover several hundred square miles. More people will be affected. More guardians will be needed. Is that why I was marked? I asked. Because more guardians are needed? Partly, he said, but also because you have the right kind of consciousness. Most people can't handle expanded temporal awareness. It drives them mad, makes them unable to function. But a few people, maybe 1 in a million, have minds that can adapt, that can hold multiple time streams simultaneously without fragmenting. You're one of those few. When I emerged from my fifth expedition, a month had passed in the outside world. I'd subjectively experienced about 12 hours. But something had changed. I could feel the wound now, even when I wasn't near it. Could sense its presence like a distant beacon. Could perceive the temporal currents flowing through it, even from hundreds of miles away. I was becoming more bridge than human, more guardian than trooper. And I was beginning to understand that this was irreversible. The version of me that existed before entering the wound was gone, replaced by something that straddled multiple temporal states, that perceived reality in ways that couldn't be reconciled with normal human consciousness. And I've met others like me. Not many, but a few. People who've been marked by various temporal anomalies around the country, who've become bridges, who serve as unofficial guardians. There's a network of us, connected not by organization, but by shared experience, by our ability to perceive and navigate the zones where time becomes unstable. We share information. We warn each other of changes. We try to protect people from stumbling into something they can't understand. One of them, A woman named Elena, who was marked by the Nevada anomaly, told me something that has stayed with me. She said, "We think of time as this external thing, this universal clock that ticks forward independent of us. But what if that's wrong? What if time is something we create, something that emerges from consciousness itself? The anomalies might be places where that creation process breaks down, where the consensus reality of linear time gives way to something more fundamental, more true. If she's right, if time really is something we participate in creating, rather than something that exists independent of us, then the anomalies aren't aberrations. They're glimpses of what reality actually is beneath the illusion of consistent, linear time. And those of us who've been marked, we're not damaged or broken. We're just people who've seen through the illusion and can't unsee it. I'm still a state trooper. I still patrol the highways, still help stranded motorists, still write tickets and respond to accidents. But I also serve another function now. I'm the person they call when someone goes missing on Route 85. I'm the one who can sense whether they're still alive in the wound, experiencing time at a different rate. Sometimes I can guide them out, using my sensitivity to the anomaly's flows to find paths that lead back to normal time. Not always. Some people go too deep, cross temporal horizons I can't follow them past. But sometimes I bring them home. Ms. Chen, the woman I met during my first encounter with the anomaly, she comes back periodically for testing. The researchers want to understand why she was affected but not marked, why she emerged from the zone without the ongoing sensitivity I developed. She's coping with her lost month, rebuilding her life, though she told me she sometimes dreams of the zone, of the spiraling time, and the feeling of existing in multiple moments at once. I met with her 3 months after our initial encounter at a coffee shop in Phoenix, far from the wound, but close enough that I could feel its distant presence like a cold spot in my awareness. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner, more drawn, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleep difficulties and stress. But there was also a kind of intensity about her, a focus that hadn't been there before. "I've been doing research," she told me, pulling out a laptop and opening a series of files. "I'm a software engineer, remember? I approach problems systematically, so I started collecting data about the wound, about temporal anomalies, about people who've experienced what we experienced." She showed me spreadsheets filled with dates, locations, names, and incident descriptions. She'd compiled a database of over 200 reported cases of temporal anomalies across the United States, going back to the 1800s. She'd found patterns, correlations, connections that even the government researchers had missed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a map she'd created showing the locations of reported temporal anomalies. "See how they're distributed? Not random. They follow a pattern, roughly geometric, like they're marking points on a grid." I studied the map. She was right. The anomalies, when plotted, formed a pattern that looked almost like a circuit diagram, with major nodes connected by lines of smaller incidents. "And here's the interesting part," she continued. "The intensity of the anomalies has been increasing over time, not in a smooth progression, but in jumps, sudden increases that happen at specific intervals." She showed me a graph. The jumps occurred roughly every 23 years, going back to at least 1922. The last jump was in 2014. If the pattern holds, the next one should be in 2037. What do you think it means I asked. She looked at me with those intense eyes. I think the anchors, or whatever is generating these anomalies, are part of a system that's activating in stages. Like a computer booting up, running diagnostic routines, preparing for some final operation. And I think we're approaching the final stage. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's air conditioning. You're saying this has all been preparation? For what? She shook her head. I don't know. But I've found references in historical documents, mostly from indigenous oral traditions that were recorded by anthropologists, that suggest the anchors were placed to prepare the world for something called the convergence. A time when all possible timelines would merge, when linear causality would break down globally, when consciousness would expand to embrace all moments simultaneously. That's apocalyptic, I said. Or transcendent, she replied, depending on your perspective. She closed her laptop and looked at me directly. I need to tell you something. I've been experiencing effects too. Not as strong as yours, but they're there. Sometimes I'll look at a clock and see it showing 2 different times simultaneously. Sometimes I'll remember conversations I haven't had yet. Sometimes I'll feel like I'm in 2 places at once, living 2 different versions of the same moment. You were marked too, I said, just not as strongly. She nodded. The researchers don't know. I haven't told them. But I wanted to tell you because I think we need to work together. We need to understand what the wound is really for, what the anchors are building toward. Because if my analysis is correct, if there really is a convergence coming, we need to know whether it's something we should try to stop or something we should try to prepare for. I spent the next hour sharing with her everything I'd learned during my expeditions, everything Whitehorse had told me, everything I'd read in the Guardian Journal. She listened intently, occasionally making notes, asking questions that showed she was processing the information, not just emotionally, but analytically. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at her coffee cup. My mother disappeared in the wound, she finally said. 1978. She was driving Route 85. Never came home. I've been searching for her ever since I was old enough to understand what happened. That's why I was on that highway that night. I'd heard rumors about the temporal anomaly, read reports that matched what happened to her. I was looking for answers. I met her, I said gently, during one of my expeditions. Margaret Chen still exists inside the zone, but in an expanded temporal state. She wanted me to tell you that she's not lost, just elsewhere. Ms. Chen's hands tightened around her coffee cup, her knuckles going white. You saw her? You spoke to her? I told her about the encounter, about Margaret's message, about the choice she'd made to let go of linear time and exist in all her moments simultaneously. Ms. Chen listened with tears streaming down her face, but when I finished, she was smiling. She's okay, Ms. Chen whispered. All these years, wondering if she suffered, if she was afraid, if she died alone. And she's okay. She made a choice. She's somewhere I can't reach, but she's okay. We talked for another hour, making plans, agreeing to share information, deciding to coordinate our research efforts. She would analyze the data, look for patterns and predictions. I would continue exploring the wound, mapping its structure, understanding its purpose. Together, we might be able to figure out what was really happening, what the anchors were built to accomplish, and whether the convergence she'd identified was a threat or a transformation. As I drove back to my home that evening, I thought about what she'd said. A system activating in stages, preparing for a final operation. It matched what I'd felt in the core, the sense that the anchor was working toward something, that the temporal distortions weren't random chaos, but purposeful preparation. And I thought about the guardians, people like Whitehorse's grandfather and Joshua Klein and Margaret Chen, who'd given up their linear existence to serve as bridges. Were they volunteers in some cosmic preparation? Or were they victims of something they couldn't understand? Maybe both. Maybe the choice wasn't between those two options, but between accepting the role and being destroyed by resisting it. I thought about Trooper Richardson, who died in his patrol car waiting for a dawn that never came, because he tried to resist, tried to maintain his grip on linear time, even as it disintegrated around him. And I thought about my own future, the slow transformation I was undergoing, the gradual shift from being a human who experienced time sequentially to being something else, something that existed across multiple temporal states simultaneously. Last week, I drove Route 85 again, at night, approaching the wound intentionally for the first time outside of official research expeditions. I parked at mile marker 47 and got out of my vehicle, feeling the boundary ahead of me, the place where time begins to bend. I stood there in the desert night, the stars overhead wheeling in their slow dance, and I felt the wound pulse with something that might have been awareness. And I understood then what the old ones knew, what Whitehorse's grandfather had tried to explain. The wound isn't a place, it's a question. It asks everyone who approaches it, are you willing to give up the illusion of linear time? Are you willing to see reality as it actually is, vast and interconnected and strange beyond human comprehension? Are you willing to become something more than you were, at the cost of being able to return to the simple certainty you had before? I answered that question months ago when I entered the zone the first time. But standing there at the boundary, I chose again. I chose to accept what I'd become. I chose to serve as a bridge, to help others navigate the space between normal time and the strange temporality of the wound. I chose to give up the life I'd known before, the simple existence of a state trooper with a wife and kids and a future I could predict. In exchange, I gained something I'm still learning to understand. I gained the ability to see time as it really is, not a line, but a web, not a river, but an ocean, with currents and eddies and depths that go down forever. I gained the ability to exist in multiple moments, to feel the connections between what was and what is and what might be. And I gained a responsibility to protect people from stumbling into something they can't comprehend, to help those who do stumble to find their way back, to study and understand, and eventually maybe help heal the places where reality's skin is torn. If you're watching this and you're planning to drive Route 85 through southern Arizona, here's what you need to know. Between mile markers 47 and 70, there's a zone where time doesn't work the way you think it does. The boundaries are growing. The effects are intensifying. And if you enter it unprepared, you might lose more than time. You might lose your connection to the reality you've always known. Don't drive that section after dark. Don't stop if you can avoid it. Don't investigate unusual signs or structures. And if you do enter the zone and feel time starting to behave strangely, turn around immediately. Get out while you still can. Because there are some of us who can't leave anymore, who are bound to the wound, serving as guardians, as bridges, as warnings. We exist in the space between moments, watching over the boundary, trying to protect the unaware. We're the reason you sometimes see patrol vehicles parked at mile marker 47 or 70, officers standing outside their cars, watching the desert. We're not on break. We're standing watch. My name is Trooper Marcus Webb, badge number 2847, Arizona Department of Public Safety. I patrol the highways of this state, and I guard the boundary where time breaks down. If you see me standing at the edge of the wound, I'm not lost. I'm exactly where I need to be. Welcome to Arizona. Drive carefully. And remember, time isn't what you think it is. It's vast and strange and beautiful and terrible, and there are places where you can see its true face if you're brave enough or foolish enough to look. I've looked. I can't look away. And every day, I choose again to serve as a bridge between the world you know and the impossible temporality that exists just beyond the next mile marker. Some boundaries are better left uncrossed, but someone has to watch over them, to help those who cross anyway, to maintain the fragile barrier between normal time and the zones where time becomes something else entirely. That's what I do now. That's what I'll do until the day I cross a temporal horizon I can't return from. And then someone else will take my place, marked by the wound, transformed by the experience, choosing to serve as guardian of the boundary between what is and what could be. Time isn't a line. Time is a web. And I exist at one of the points where the threads intersect, watching, waiting, protecting. This is the Arizona case. This is what happens when you drive too long on Route 85 after dark. This is what I know now that I can never unknow. And this is why, when you see a state trooper standing alone in the desert at night, watching something you can't see, you should keep driving. Because what we're watching for, what we're guarding against, is something you don't want to meet. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But if you do, if you find yourself caught in a fold in time, lost in a moment that stretches on forever, remember that there are people like me who can sense your presence, who will come looking for you in the spaces between seconds, who will try to guide you home. We're here. We're watching. We're the last line of defense between the world of linear time and the vast, strange temporality that exists beneath it. Welcome to the wound. I hope you never need to know what that means. But if you do, I'll be here, standing at the boundary, existing in multiple moments, serving as a bridge. Because that's what I chose to become the moment I entered the zone and came back changed. This is Trooper Webb, signing off. Drive safe. Stay out of the zone. And remember, if you lose time on Route 85, it's not lost. It's just somewhere you can't reach anymore. Somewhere I might be able to find you if you're lucky. Somewhere I'll be standing watch forever, or until the wound finally claims me completely. Time isn't a line. Time is a web. And I'm one of the spiders now, watching over the spaces where the threads connect. That's the truth they don't want you to know. That's what happened to me. That's what I've become. And that's why, when you drive past mile marker 47 on Route 85 on a dark Arizona night, you might see a patrol vehicle parked there, lights off, an officer standing beside it, watching the road ahead with eyes that see more than they should. That's me. That's us. The guardians of the wound. The bridges between times. The ones who chose to accept the mark and serve the boundary. Welcome to Arizona. The desert remembers everything, and some of us remember more than we should, because we've seen the web beneath the line, the ocean beneath the river, the truth beneath the illusion of linear time. Drive carefully. The wound is waiting, and so am I.